important and challenging conference. Important, obviously, and challenging because of the issues it addresses, but also important because I think it's crucial for people working in the humanities today to be able to have occasions to try to address issues that don't normally fall within their purview, but that are of obvious and urgent civic importance, and also to show that a background in the humanities can be relevant and useful for bringing questions and problems and insights that aren't usually associated with these issues. And I take that to be one of the stakes in organizing this conference. When I was told that I had up to 90 minutes for this paper, I hadn't written anything at all, and I panicked, and I said, of course, I won't need anything like that. I won't have time to write anything as long as that. And of course, as it turned out, I'm going to come close to filling that, but I want to reassure you that the second half of the talk will have a great deal of visual elements. We'll be commenting a film, and then some photographs. And so that will hopefully make the time pass more quickly. The first part is then more theoretical, so we'll get that out of the way first. And there is a subtitle for this talk. It's called Clouds on a Possible Relation of Terror and Terrorism to Aesthetics. And yeah, this is something written for this conference. It's still very much therefore work in progress. Now, it seems clear that the topic of our conference, although framed extremely broadly in the call for papers, is informed, consciously or unconsciously, perhaps even haunted, by a single series of images, which begins with a plane silhouetted against the blue sky, disappearing into one of the towers of the World Trade Center, and which ends, well, I'm not quite sure where it ends, or even if it has really ended. Perhaps its end, that day at least, was really only a beginning. In any case, the sequence of images reaches a certain culmination with the collapse of the towers into clouds of dust and rubble. Who, especially today, can avoid these images which have been broadcast incessantly on TV and most recently to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the event? What could be more vivid than these spectacular images of death and destruction? But what could also be more obscure? In what follows, I'm going to present some thoughts related to these images and to some other images that seem to me also to bear on our topic. I wish these thoughts could be presented in a more systematic fashion, that they could be more densely structured, more comprehensive and cohesive in character, and that they, above all, could come together to form a tightly knit and cogent argument. But I feel that I won't be able to pull this off today at least, and I beg your indulgence at the outset for their incomplete, fragmentary, and exploratory nature. Perhaps some of that can be compensated for in the discussion afterwards. When we speak of images, we here being both academics and also non-academics, we generally expect a certain transparency. Images are expected to show things, to reveal, to be windows onto the world in one form or another. This they surely are and do, but as the digitalization of images has recently emphasized, but it's in fact a thought that goes back at least as far back to Plato, the so-called transparency of images can also serve to conceal as much as to disclose. This is particularly so when we have to do with memory images. And yet, are not all images, in fact, memory images? If so, a notion elaborated by Freud can put us perhaps on the track of the complexities such images entail. I'm thinking of those memories that Freud called screen memories. In German, the term he uses is slightly different. It's Deckerinnerung, literally memories that cover or cover up. Such memories need not be based on perceptions. They need not even be images in the usual sense of that word, but they often are. Freud developed this notion based on the recurrence of certain very vivid memory images in the course of analysis. Images, however, which, as he discovered, served more to conceal, to cover up, than to reveal. In so doing, these images met the demands of repression, while at the same time concealing the gaps that would otherwise make such repression manifest, and therefore less effective. The English translation of Deckerinnerung as screen memory is felicitous, insofar as it suggests this double function of the image as screen. First, to provide a support for representations and projections, and second, to screen out other images and elements that could disrupt the unity of self-consciousness and therefore fall prey to repression. I want to suggest that the questions of terror and terrorism, here and today, are linked to the series of images etched in all of our memories of those two planes striking the World Trade Center, setting it on fire, and ultimately causing the towers to implode into a cloud of dust. But I also want to argue that in the process of rememorization, precisely this sequence of images has often functioned as a collective, and sometimes even globally collective, screen memory, whose major function has been and continues to be to focus our attention on individual acts, actors, and events, while screening out other considerations, not just other images, but also other thoughts that might have, and perhaps should have, been aroused and explored in relation to this occurrence. This type of screening has been especially effective within the United States, where it enjoys the full support and collaboration of the mainstream media, particularly televisual. Media elsewhere, for instance in Europe and in Asia, have been far more critical, situating the images of 9/11 in a much larger historical and political context. But to the extent that the images of 9/11 have been exploited to justify a largely military response, namely the war against terror, this being only the most conspicuous aspect of this response, what I would call, adapting a notion of Walter Benjamin's, to which I'll return later on, what I would call the aesthetization of the image has been and continues to be a decisive factor. Now, when I speak of an aesthetization of the image in the media, I need to add an important caveat. The word aesthetics, like most other words, and especially terms that have a long and significant history, is overdetermined and ambiguous. It has sometimes signified the very opposite of what I will be using it as, taking my cue from Benjamin and Heidegger, but also from Paul de Man*s notion of aesthetic ideology and Philippe Lacoue-Labad's notion of national aestheticism. These last named critics associate the notion of aesthetics with concepts such as form and work. Now, I feel justified in using this particular tradition because of the power that has gathered around it and which has ramifications in areas far removed from its immediate applications, which is to say to art, beauty, and the sublime. Through this term of aestheticization, I want to suggest that a certain very powerful tradition of aesthetics has facilitated and even promoted the utilization and political exploitation of images as screen memories in the Freudian sense. Ever since Aristotle, and with many significant exceptions, such as Kant, this particular tradition has tended to screen out the screen function of images and to valorize it as a more or less neutral, more or less truthful window on the world. I use this phrase in full awareness that the restaurant that was on the World Trade Center, where I actually once had a meal, also had that name. It was this particular aesthetic tradition that Walter Benjamin had in mind when, in his essay on the work of art in the age of its technical reproducibility, he sought to develop an alternative to what he called the aestheticization of politics that he attributed to fascism. I will return to this question a little bit later on in this talk. But first, in order to understand how a certain tradition of aesthetics could contribute to what has been called a culture of fear, a culture that goes hand in hand with a politics that determines terror and terrorism to be its primary enemies, it will be helpful to introduce a second Freudian concept related to the first, even if Freud, to my knowledge himself, never linked these two concepts or discussed their relationship. This second concept has been largely overlooked in theoretical discussions, perhaps because, unlike screen memory, it makes use of an utterly banal and non-technical word that has nothing specifically psychoanalytic about it, and that perhaps was felt to be too familiar to catch anyone's attention or imagination. In contrast to screen memory, which Freud discovers and discusses very early on in his career, starting with an article written in 1899, the second concept is one he comes to late in life, discussing it at length only in his 1925 book, Inhibition, Symptom, Anxiety. I am referring here to the notion of isolation, which Freud introduces in that book in the context of his discussion of defense mechanisms developed by the ego, in particular in obsessional neurosis. In contrast to repression, which excludes representations from consciousness by replacing them with other representations or symptoms, isolation does not exclude representation from consciousness and hence from memory, but rather it does something else. It eliminates all the connections that could allow the representation in question to exercise a disruptive power. This is how Freud describes the process. I don't know if you've had handouts of the quotes. If you do, this is your first of 5 quotes on the handout, but I'll read it slowly. Hopefully you can follow. Freud writes, when something unpleasant has happened to the subject, or when he himself has done something that has significance for his neurosis, he interpolates an interval during which nothing further must happen, during which he must perceive nothing and do nothing. The experience is not forgotten, but instead it is deprived of its affect, and its associative connections are suppressed or interrupted, so that it remains as though isolated. 2 points deserve special emphasis here. First, that what is deprived by isolation, what Freud calls its associative connections, relates to what he names as affect. He writes, I just quoted it, the experience is not forgotten, but instead is deprived of its affect. Isolation, therefore, which relates to experiences, does what repression cannot do according to Freud. Namely, it displaces affects. You may remember that Freud often insists on the fact that repression, in turn, relates only to representations, not to affects, which he insists cannot be experienced unconsciously and therefore cannot be repressed. Only representations can be repressed. Now, if Freud uses the word experiences here to designate the object of isolation, it's because here again he wishes to distinguish it from repression, which relates only to representations. Isolation, as we've seen from the quote, also relates to affects, but as a result, it also involves the body. As Freud puts it, it takes place in the motor sphere, which is to say, the interpolation of an interval during which nothing further must happen, as Freud puts it, which thus constitutes the movement of isolation. It must be understood not just as a mental event, but as a motoric one. Quote, the effect of this isolation is the same as the effect of repression with amnesia, but with a supplement. This is now the second quote on your sheet, short. Freud writes, it is at the same time given motor reinforcement for magical purposes. The elements that are held apart in this way are those that belong together associatively. The motor isolation is meant to ensure an interruption of the connection in thought. What Freud is describing here is situated, therefore, at the cusp between mental and physical, or rather, it tends to break down the clear-cut distinction between them. Nowhere is this clearer, but also more hidden, than in the verb he uses to describe the actual operation of isolating things, Things, he writes, that belong together associatively are held apart, in German auseinandergehalten, magically by the isolating interpolation. Why magic here? In order to designate precisely that the process described, although not consciously or deliberately willed, nevertheless involves an intentional act, and this in a double sense. First, in other words, the word magic refers to the particular kind of intentionality that is involved here. First, in order for something to be interrupted, as with isolation, its movement must be directional and at some level recognized as such. Isolation operates, therefore, by intentionally, although not self-consciously, interrupting the no less intentional, goal-directed, purposive movement of mind and body. It does this by inserting, Freud's German word is Einschub, literally shoving in, something into the trajectory of the movement of the drive. However, since its primary function is to interrupt and to suspend, this insert can be entirely empty of content, and often is. It can consist in a blank space, for instance. It must simply arrest the forward thrust of the drive, nothing more but also nothing less. Nevertheless, in order for this isolating intervention to be effective, it must also have a certain duration or durability. The interruption must therefore consist in what could be called a holding action. Freud designates this more particularly, I've already quoted it, as a holding apart, auseinanderhalten. To hold things apart, however, one must first take hold of them, that is, make some sort of initial contact. This, however, creates a new problem. For according to Freud, isolation is motivated by what he calls one of the oldest and most fundamental commands of obsessional neurosis, namely the taboo on touching, end quote. Freud goes on to explain just why this taboo is so powerful. This is quote 3 on your sheet. If we ask ourselves why the avoidance of touching, contact, or contagion should play such a large part in this neurosis, and should become the subject matter of complicated systems, the answer is that touching and physical contact are the immediate aim of the aggressive as well as the loving object cathexis. Eros desires contact because it strives to make the I, my translation of what's usually rendered in English as ego, it's because it strives to make the I and the loved object one. But destructiveness too, which, before the invention of long-range weapons, could only take effect at close quarters, must presuppose physical contact, a coming to grips, literally in German, Hand anlegen, laying hand on, handling. But isolating is removing the possibility of contact. It is a method of withdrawing a thing from being touched in any way. End quote. Now, Freud does not say explicitly just why or how the conflictual mix of erotic desire and aggressivity involved in touching should particularly give rise to something like isolating. But his reference to the ego, the I, suggests a possible response. The main task of the I is to organize and, if possible, harmonize and integrate the contradictory tendencies of the psyche, which, according to Freud's so-called second psychic typology, are located in the it, my translation for it, the superego, and the I. To the I falls the task then of bringing the largely divergent strivings of it and superego into some sort of unified, well-defined, and stable structure. Touching, however, embodies the impossibility of this task. It epitomizes what Freud elsewhere calls ambivalence, the simultaneous presence of urges that oppose or conflict with each other, above all the erotic drive for unification with the object or the other, and the aggressive drive to destroy it. One way the I tries to deal with these conflicts is precisely by excluding touching through isolating the antagonistic drives. If these drives can be separated and isolated, they may not conflict with each other and disturb the integrative function of the I. In a certain sense, and this will be important to us later on, isolation of the object, say of an image or a series of images, is desirable to the I because it reinforces the unity and stability of the I qua individual, literally as a being considered to be indivisible. Where touching takes place, by contrast, the limits of such indivisibility are compromised by contact, if not by conflict. Isolation thus attempts to institute and perpetuate a situation in which touching, that is contact and conflict, has become impossible. But if the only way the I can accomplish this task is by holding apart what otherwise belongs together, it has a serious problem. And for holding, and a fortiori holding apart, requires contact, touching, i.e. some sort of coming together. It's only by coming together then that one can hold apart. But holding apart is not simply touching, it is a touching in order to lay hold of, that is, to control, to fix into place. Now the problem faced by the I here is even more complicated. If it must touch the drives, desires, experiences, representations, in order to hold them apart, it must to a certain degree also be touched by them. For touching is never simply active or transitive. It's also simultaneously and inevitably passive. In touching the other, one is inevitably touched by that other. Touching, as Derrida, Nancy, and many others have remarked, is therefore necessarily ambivalent with respect to the established opposition and polarity of subject and object, self and other, active and passive. How the I then deals with these ambivalences becomes clearer when Freud relates it to an act that is not only part of the pathology of obsessional neurosis, but indeed is a major factor in the constitution of so-called normal, rational thought and behavior. This is quote 4 on your list. The normal phenomenon of concentration, Freud writes, provides a pretext for this kind of neurotic procedure. What seems to us important in the way of an impression or a piece of work must not be interfered with by the simultaneous claims of any other mental processes or activities. But even a normal person uses concentration to keep away not only what is irrelevant or unimportant, but above all, what is unsuitable because it is contradictory. He is most disturbed by those elements which once belonged together, but which have been torn apart in the course of his process of development, as, for instance, the ambivalence of his father complex in his relation to God. Thus, in the normal course of things, the I has a great deal of isolating work to do in its function of directing the current of thought. End quote. Insofar as one very important function of the I consists in directing the current of thought, it must first locate a goal in a stable, self-enclosed place toward which that current can then be channeled. The process of determining such a goal, concentration, entails for Freud, therefore, not just the positive activity of locating a place or an object, but simultaneously of stabilizing that place. Concentration thus touches its object, but since this object is initially situated in a conflictual force field of desires or drives, it can only keep it in place and retain its hold over it by separating it from the heterogeneous ramifications that in part constitute and determine it. Concentration thus touches doubly. It requires two hands, as it were, if it is to hold apart, which also means to keep apart what originally belonged together and what presumably, if left to its own devices, would stay together or come together again, albeit in a conflictual togetherness with one another. But concentration is mostly a cognitive activity. One concentrates on something in order to observe it better and ultimately to know it. Insofar as the process of concentration is understood as a cognitive process, it is experienced as mental rather than as physical, involving the body. If concentration touches on its object, this is generally understood to be merely a metaphorical way of describing its relation to an object that is considered to transcend the bodily limitations of spatial temporal situatedness. For concentration seeks to focus on the object itself, independently of its possible variations in space and time. As you've just heard, in English, but also in other languages, an often used synonym for concentration is the word focus. To focus on an object is to construe the object, the process of concentration by referring it to visual perception. Such a reference, however, is plausible only insofar as it is informed by an experience or conception of visuality that is culturally and historically constituted and therefore relative, not universal. However, this experience tends to regard itself precisely as universal and as objective, and this for in part internal reasons. For it consists in equating a particular mode of seeing with visuality itself. This particular mode of seeing consists in the interpretation of perception as essentially a mode of apprehending and recognizing objects construed as being self-contained and meaningful in order to be apprehendable. This object-oriented conception of visual perception divides the field of vision often into a duality of figure and ground, without questioning just how the field of perception is delimited in the first place. In other words, the framing of the field of vision is taken for granted as a given, in order that vision itself can be construed in terms of an internal differentiation between figure and ground, foreground and background. In French, this opposition is known as that between forme et fond. I mention this in order to introduce two of the words and concepts that will bear on our topic in this conference, or at least in my discussion of it, namely the notion of form and figure. These two concepts may not cover the entire realm of aesthetics, but they certainly inform the interpretation that has related it to art, beauty, and sublimity in the Western tradition. A form, as Kant writes in his critique of the power to judge, is where the concept of form, despite playing a decisive role throughout that text, is never really elaborated. A form, according to Kant, is constituted through the unifying synthesis of a manifold in its singularity, i.e., without recourse to a general concept that, qua general, would be external to the aesthetic experience, insofar as, for Kant at least, this experience cannot be separated from a singular encounter and representation. Although through this insistence on singularity, Kant's interpretation of the aesthetic is distinguished from that of his illustrious predecessors, such as Baumgarten and Winkelmann, he retains the notion of form and tries to reconcile it precisely with the singularity of aesthetic judgment. One of the concrete points of divergence that separate Kant from his predecessors has to do with the significance of the human body as the site of what is called the ideal of beauty. This goes back to Winkelmann, who insists on the aesthetic qualities of the human body in Greek sculpture as an object of representation. Kant rejects this aesthetic privilege of the human body precisely because it would impose an objective ideal of beauty on what for Kant has to remain tied to a singular and subjective experience. This is also the reason why Kant subordinates artistic to natural beauty in his discussion of aesthetic judgment, not because he prefers landscapes to people, but because he wants to safeguard the singularity of the aesthetic encounter from being contaminated by any sort of conceptual generality. And this would be the case, inevitably, for him at least, in the encounter with artistic beauty, since the latter would always be understood as the realization of a prior intention of the artist that itself would be of a general or generalizing character. The artist has something in mind which then is realized in the beautiful work. Without being able to discuss this question in further detail here, suffice it to say that in Kant, the notion of form tends to unravel in the third critique in the face of his continued insistence on the singularity of the aesthetic encounter, and that for this reason, Kant can be seen as inaugurating a distinctively modern tradition of aesthetics, which, while seeking to perpetuate its more classical claims to unification and harmonization, also opens aesthetics constitutively to conflict and to struggle. A line that then will lead more or less directly then to Nietzsche. Benjamin, Heidegger, Derrida, Nietzsche are just some of the more influential modern thinkers who have read Kant in this way against the grain of his own systematic intention. Perhaps more as a thinker of unresolved conflicts and problems than of unshakable foundations. The pre- and post-Kantian identification of the human body as the epitome both of the aesthetic object and of bodies per se has a long history, which I cannot begin to unfold here in any detail. I just go on to say that it seems to me that in today's discourse about embodiment, very often at least, this very classical, what I would call oncotheological notion of the body continues to be determinant. This history, which I can't go into, has to be mentioned, however, since it remains, I want to argue, also the implicit precondition of much of what is experienced as terror today. Suffice it to say that much of its emotional force of this tradition is grounded in a tradition informed by Christian theology, for which the human form and body is the site both of the most extreme suffering and violence, and yet because of this also of the possibility of resurrection and restitution. Deriving both from the biblical account of human beings created in the image of their Creator, and from the Christian account of the crucifixion and resurrection of the Son of God, the human body emerges as the site of suffering, but also of salvation, often reconciled through the notion of martyrdom. Plays obviously an important role in the question of terror and terrorism. Not strictly in a Christian context, of course, but in a biblical context. What I want to suggest is that although this salvational potential is associated particularly with a certain view of the human body, the latter accordingly provides the basis upon which all bodies are then construed. In other words, a theological model informs an aesthetic paradigm that in turn serves as a criterion for how reality is or should be understood. Put simply, and surely too simply, if the universe is conceived of as the creation of a self-identical and exclusive deity, then all aspects of that universe are meaningful and valuable insofar as they reflect the process of their origin. Aesthetic objects are thus understood as products of creation, a word that continues to be used in a secular context, but which I believe retains the theological structure from which it derives. Creatures derive their life from their creator. Art objects derive their value from their artistic creator. Objects in general, according to this paradigm, have being insofar as that being is the product of an originating intention. This is the attitude that informs also Christian fundamentalist views of the universe as the product of what in the United States is called intelligent design, rather than of the aleatory process of evolution. The fact that contemporary science increasingly emphasizes the aleatory, not just in evolutionary theory, but also, for example, in quantum mechanics, far from eliminating theological and teleological conceptions of reality, can, as we see, actually provoke and promote them, in part as a reaction to a worldview that provides little consolation or solace for everyday anxieties and suffering. The ostensibly secular aesthetic notions of form and figure are traditionally associated with this teleological view of the world, even where they seek, as in Kant, to take their distances from it. Kant's famous formula for the aesthetic judgment of the beautiful as purposiveness without purpose reflects this link even while subjectivizing it. Why, however, should notions of intelligent design, and more generally the belief in some sort of transcendent intention pervading the world, help to assuage such anxieties and concerns, and thereby continue to impose themselves, at least in the United States, on large portions of the population in the face of the near universal opposition of the scientific and intellectual establishment? Perhaps because the very notion of intention and design implies the ability to overcome the uncertainties that spatial temporal experience inevitably entails for living beings, and in the contemporary world increasingly for the majority of them as the socioeconomic conditions of life become increasingly precarious, especially, but not only, in the so-called developed nations. The realization of a plan or a project implied in notions of intention or design can be seen as embodying the power to overcome such anxieties and concerns especially wherever traditional modes of survival through work, for instance, seem increasingly uncertain. The tension in cultures that are informed by the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as it's called in the Declaration of Independence, on the one hand, and the reality of ever more precarious conditions under which that life must be lived, seems to produce an increased desire for systems of belief that would guarantee what society no longer does. Now, in aesthetics of form and figure, and aesthetics of representation, and here the connection of all of these remarks with our topic will hopefully begin to re-emerge, and aesthetics of form and figure also can and does respond to this desire, especially when that aesthetics serves as a model according to which reality can be construed and conceived. What Carl Schmitt, back in the 1920s, in a short book entitled Roman Catholicism and Political Form, called the principle of representation, in which he located the distinctive political significance and power of the Catholic Church, dominates the televisual media today in the United States, but also in many other parts of the world. This principle of representation that Schmitt saw epitomized in the crucifixion, in which the mortal human body is promised a resurrection through suffering, provides a view of the world in which terror and terrorism and violence more generally can appear as necessary passages toward salvation. This is not to say that such an effect is the only one that such sacrificial representation can produce, but only that a long and deeply founded tradition seeks to demonstrate a connection between death as punishment and salvation through sacrifice. It is through a certain form of representation, through representation as the formation of form and at the same time as its transcendence, that such a salvational process can be embodied, as it were, in a world in which finitude is considered essentially to be punishment for sin. Representation thus represents what is never directly accessible. It makes the invisible visible, the unimaginable vivid. I should add that for Schmitt, the principle of representation in this sense is not primarily aesthetic, but legal. It is not aesthetic form, but legal formalism that anticipates the passage, or rather the leap, from the finite to the infinite, from the mortal to the immortal. His argument can also, I believe, be applied to the use of aesthetic forms and figures, especially where they are not intended to portray beauty as such, but reality. If one follows the previous argument that it is the sacralized individual human body that informs the conception of reality as such, then the use of images can be no less potent than legal formalism in providing or supporting a belief system that claims to link the finite to the infinite. Schmitt's emphasis on legal formalism over aesthetic form in outlining his principle of representation surely has to do with the spiritualizing abstraction of such form, by contrast with the corporeal nature of the aesthetic. But precisely because of its intimate relation to bodily individuation, images precisely can figure, and have figured, that reassuring promise of sacrificial self-redemption. The self being tied to the individual being tied to the body. To be sure, such figuration will always retain an element of ambiguity and uncertainty, given that its claim to transcendence is necessarily tied to the representation of immanence. And it is here, perhaps, that the function of the cloud can enter the picture, or rather of clouds. For there's almost always more than one. Or rather, the unity of the cloud is never stable or assured, which is part of what allows it to seem to bridge the gap between the world of finite space and time, the world of the figure, and the beyond. This is perhaps also why clouds often seem to conceal something like a secret, and even a certain violence that can both terrify but also console. In the time remaining, I want to look at two very different and yet unrelated not unrelated instances of clouds, in which a certain aestheticism converges with terror and terrorism, albeit in very different ways and at very different historical moments, but moments which I believe are related. So that's the theoretical part. Now comes the image part. I can close the curtains and so on.